Okay, welcome back to Lighting in Hazardous Areas Part 2. Or Lighting in Explosive Atmospheres Part 2, rather. I just wanted to cover off a couple more things before I let you loose on this one. So there's going to be a couple of questions in the test about regulation, so let's have a look at that. The first one I want to cover is Regulation 65, Requirement for Certificate of Compliance. This tells us in what situations we will need a Certificate of Compliance. It says here right at the start, 65.1, Certificate of Compliance must be issued in accordance with these regulations for all general and high-risk prescribed electrical work done on an installation or part installation that comprises installation and maintenance of conductors, or the installation or maintenance of fittings where the fittings are connected or intended to be connected to conductors used in the installation. So if we're installing or maintaining conductors or fittings, a certificate of compliance must be issued. And let's go down a little bit and have a look here. No high risk prescribed electrical work may be treated as complete until a certificate of compliance along with any record of inspection required for that prescribed electrical work is issued for it. So remembering that work in explosive atmospheres, hazardous areas is deemed to be high risk. Okay, so this requires us to have all of our work, whether high risk or not, any installation or maintenance of conductors or fittings to be a certificate of compliance is required. And that it says that high risk electrical work is not complete until the certificate of compliance is issued, along with any record of inspection required. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit and have a look at Regulation 70. High risk prescribed electrical work to be inspected. All high risk prescribed electrical work done on a low or extra low voltage installation or part installation must be inspected as required by Regulation 59 or 60. I recommend that you scroll up and have a look at Regulation 60. You're going to have to find this is the New Zealand Electrical Regulations. This is free on the internet, so you can find this. So bring that up and have a look at it. So I recommend that you have a look at Regulation 60. It will tell you, actually the most important thing that it will tell you is what standard you require to install and inspect your work to in a hazardous area. So this regulation here tells us that all high risk work must be inspected. All high risk work must be inspected. Further down here, it tells us who may carry out that inspection. So we can read that, who's allowed to carry out the inspection. How that inspection is to be recorded is here. What we must do with that record of inspection, Regulation 72, and offences relating to the inspection. So that means that Regulation 70 tells us, there it is right at the top, high risk prescribed electrical work to be inspected. So Regulation 70 tells us that high risk work must be inspected. 71 through to 73 tells us the specifics of those inspections, who's allowed to do it, what they must do with the records, any offences, etc. Regulation 60, if I click on that, Regulation 60 will tell us the following installations must be installed, tested, inspected, and connected to comply with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000 and also with the standard indicator. So this tells us that for particular installations we must follow particular standards in addition to AS NZS 3000. So for hazardous areas, it says it here, we must also follow AS NZS 60079.14, and we'll be familiar with some of these. We've got medical devices, mobile medical facilities, connectable installation or pleasure vessel, and that tells us the different standards that we would use for those installations. But for hazardous areas, it's this one. So regulation 60 tells us what standard we require to inspect to or install and inspect to. Regulation 70 tells us that the work needs to be inspected. 65 told us that the work requires certification, requires a certificate of compliance. And then if we keep going down, we will see regulation 75. Here we go. Regulation 75 tells us about the periodic assessment of certain installations. And again, this will be familiar from when we did reconnectable installations and that kind of thing. This tells us about re-inspection, right? So we have re-inspection intervals. Again, if we look at A, it says caravan parks, 5 years. B, boat marinas, 5 years. This should start coming back. C, installations at demolition and construction sites in accordance with ASNZS 3012. So this tells us the intervals for periodic assessment, that it means that it needs to be re-inspected by an inspector at a certain period of time. If we go down to E, there we go. Low voltage installations other than domestic installations in hazardous areas need to be periodic assessment needs to be in accordance with ASNZS 60079.17. So that's telling us the standard to which we must comply for our periodic assessment. And no doubt, because it's not given here, if we look at A, for example, it tells us that it's 5 years for a caravan park. For a hazardous installation, it does not tell us how often. So we would refer to the standard ASNZS 60079.17. That will tell us how often we must inspect in those situations. Okay, so the questions in the test that are going to ask you about regulations, it says it's going to ask you for a brief explanation of what those regulations say. Do not copy paste. Do not copy paste. I'll say that again. Don't copy paste. I don't want to see you copy and paste. I just talk through what all those regulations are. So I want you to write what those regulations means. I don't need a novel. It might be 1 or 2 sentences, but I want you to tell me what the implications of those regulations are. According to the question, answer the question. Answer the question. Do it by not copying and pasting out of here. Okay. At this point, I will tell you that the second 2 digits for our test are 74. Should have got the first 2 digits from the first video. Second 2 digits are 74. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about then is, let's have a look here. So this is a pretty good resource here. Wikipedia is not always great, but this one I can tell you I've read through it and it's pretty good. So we've got electrical equipment in hazardous areas. You will need to find this and look it up. There it is there, electrical equipment in hazardous areas. Okay. If we go down here, if we have a look, there's a lot of stuff here. Zone classification, explosive gas area classifications, dust area classifications, the gas and dust groups, temperature classifications, a lot of stuff that we talked about in that explosive atmospheres or hazardous areas unit that we've already done. I won't go back into that now, but types of protection is going to be important. We talked about a few in the PowerPoint, but there are a few more that you need to know. Here are all the ones that you'll need to know. We've got D, E, O, Q, M, P, I, N, S. We have talked about some of those before, or we talked about some of those in the PowerPoint, but not all of them. In addition to those, you also need to be aware of EXH is hermetically sealed. EXH, hermetically sealed. EXV, ventilation. I don't know a huge amount about what those are, what the specifics of that type of protection are. However, hermetically sealed, EXH, and ventilation, EXV. I would recommend that if you want to know a bit more about this stuff, and remember that while we're on our lockdown, we need to be focused on our learning rather than just the tests. Have a read of this Wikipedia article. It's really, really good. Go and watch the other videos, the other YouTube videos that are in this unit. They'll give you a bit more information. But having a look here, look, this tells us some good stuff here, like EXE, increased safety. What does it say? It tells us the standard to which it is manufactured to. It'll tell us the locations that we can use, zone 2 or zone 1, and the types of uses that it might be: motors, lighting, lighting and junction box, etc. What do we got? Flameproof here. Flameproof, it talks about the flameproof. The description also tells us it could be used in zone 1 if the gas group and temperature class are correct. So then we would go to the gas group. Here's our temperature class here. So we should find the temperature class written on our equipment, right? So it would say, generally, I think on our ones we see this T1, T2, T3. So T3, for example, if it says T3 on our equipment, that means that, as it says here, the surface temperature of that equipment will not rise above 200 degrees Celsius. Then we make an assessment depending on what our gas is, what is our hazardous atmosphere. Then we can use this equipment as long as that temperature does not exceed 80% of the auto ignition temperature of that gas or vapor, whatever it is. So if our gas had a auto ignition temperature of 250 degrees, then I could use T3. I couldn't use a T2 because that's going to get potentially up to 300 degrees. I could use a T3. I could use anything below that because that maximum temperature is going to be lower. We also look at our gas groups. So we've got group 2C, acetylene and hydrogen, group 2B plus H2, hydrogen, etc., etc. So as it said down here on our flameproof, zone 1 can use a EXE in zone 1 if our gas group and temperature class are correct. So we talked about temperature class. Is our gas group correct? So again, this will be listed on your equipment. It'll tell you it's group 2C or group 2A. So we would need to look at that and make an assessment, make a judgment on, is this the right is it the right gas group for the gas that I'm using? If I've got acetylene and hydrogen, I need it to say group 2C, for example. Cool. All right. I think that is everything. If you guys have any issues, as always, get in touch. I think that covers everything that we need to cover. See you at the next one.